Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and in this episode, I'm going to speak with well-known author and entrepreneur, Rohit Bhargava. Rohit is a marketing professional who makes his living by predicting the future, and he's also the person that coined the term social media optimization. We're going to dive into the brand new edition of his annual book, Non-Obvious, and get some insight into how you can best prepare for and take advantage of the coming trends. As always, show notes can be found on the recently redesigned futuregrind.org. We're also on iTunes, YouTube, and a brand new Future Grind Facebook page as well, so make sure to check that out. Feel free to subscribe, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. This is Future Grind. Hello, Rohit. Welcome to Future Grind.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
So let's get this started really at the beginning. What is it that you would say that you do? How do you describe your job and what it is that you do day to day?
I would say that I am an idea collector. I collect ideas pretty much the same way most of us collect frequent flyer miles, which is I save them in the moment, but then I cash them in at a later date when they become useful. And for me, cashing it in means coming up with trends based on those ideas. So I collect the ideas, I aggregate them into trends that describe the direction the world is headed based on our behaviors and based on technology, and then I write about it.
Well, there was a lot there, and I'm sure we're going to definitely break that down piece by piece to see that process. But I am really excited for this conversation in particular because your content and what you talk about and write about is so near term. And so many of the topics we cover on Future Grind are long-term, and there are a lot of variables at play, and it's hard to set a date as to when these things will happen. But your work is focused on what is already impacting the present day and will continue to grow in the near future. So you provide clear, actionable takeaways, and I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, I described this once, I think accurately, as me doing probably the dumbest thing that any author could ever do, which is choose to rewrite 35% of their book every year.
Yeah.
But what it allows me to do is come up with new trends on an annual basis. And you're right, I focus on the trends that are impacting our behavior, our organization's behavior, and what they do, why people buy something, why they don't, why they believe something or why they don't in the coming year.
And that's pretty bold on your part, I think, because then people can clearly call you out on things that didn't come to pass. Whereas if you give yourself a buffer room and say, this is going to happen in 20 to 50 years, you have a range of maybe even people forget you made the prediction by the time that comes. But you're working very much in the short term here, and especially with businesses whose profit kind of depends on quarter to quarter. Do you see that as an added pressure?
There's definitely added pressure, but I point the finger at myself quite a bit as well, and I'm pretty hard on myself. And so every new year that I come up with my trend report, and I do 15 trends every year, I look backwards and I grade my previous trend predictions based on whether they continued to accelerate or whether they didn't. And so I'm trying to do something that, you're right, a lot of people who deal with the future and who predict the future don't really do, which is have some accountability for what I said was going to happen and whether it happened or not.
Absolutely. But let's get that defined term out of the way here. What is a trend?
So for me, a trend, the way I describe it, is a curated observation of the accelerating present. And so to me, the accelerating present is really a big piece of that, which is it's something that's starting to happen right now, but it's going to accelerate. And so the prediction is that this is going to accelerate into the future.
Yeah, and just to give people an example of that from some of the things that you have that you're going to talk about in Non-Obvious 2017, which is available now, you have Fierce Femininity, Side Quirks, Desperate Detox, and then you have it broken down. You mentioned curating. You really are curating this. You're putting it into understandable pieces, giving it a name so it can be accessible to people and understandable.
Yeah, and most of my research, it really kind of breaks down into 5 categories. And the first thing you notice when you look at the 5 categories is that they're not based on industry. Because in the business world, a lot of times what you'll find is here are the technology trends, here are the retail trends, here are the financial services trends, here are the healthcare trends. And I very intentionally don't do that. Every one of my trends has examples and stories from multiple industries. And the categories I choose instead are consumer and culture behavior, marketing and social media, media and education, technology and design, and economics and entrepreneurship. So these are all really broad categories that could encompass multiple industries.
And one thing that I think you really bring to the table, which is valuable, you always get predictions about the future from technologists, people like Elon Musk or Ray Kurzweil, who talks about genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, or Kevin Kelly with Wired and writing what technology wants and the inevitable. But you have this different background and perspective you bring to the table from marketing and PR. So you really bring the cultural and the societal and what are things going to be like in day-to-day life in addition to the technology. And I think that's a great perspective to have on it.
Yeah, ultimately, I think anybody who does marketing has to be a student of human behavior. And ultimately, what marketing comes down to is understanding how people are influenced and why they are persuaded to, in most cases, buy something or believe something or not. And so that's really the background that I bring to this, which is I study people. I study why people act in the ways they do and how that relates to why organizations act in the way they do.
And how did you find yourself doing what it is that you're doing now? Just talk to me about your background, maybe your education, and how you got to this point here.
I'd say a little bit of accident and a little bit of frustration probably combined led to this. So the accident was that I had always been a writer, and so that's been my background. And I landed in marketing and advertising because that was a place where I could use my writing ability and the way that I thought about the world and the way that I wrote for creating persuasive arguments. And for me, the persuasive arguments were stories, and I just liked the way that all combined. And so that's how I landed in marketing. And the frustration, which actually led to me producing this trend report, which I first started doing in 2011. So this is actually the 7th edition of my trend report. And the reason why I did the first edition is because it was the end of the year and I was reading all of these so-called predictions of stuff. And it was about how mobile devices will be more used, or 3D printing, or Snapchat, not in 2011, but later on. And it just struck me that what these people were calling trends were just statements of stuff that existed. And that shouldn't be a trend. That should just be like, okay, Facebook exists or mobile devices exist. Great. But what's the trend? What's the behavior? Like, what are we actually describing here?
What is your method for spotting these trends? How do you curate what content you consume, and where do you look to see these things?
Lots of input. So I speak at probably 40 different events a year. And so one of the upsides of speaking at conferences and being able to travel and speak is that you get to listen to a lot of amazingly smart people if you choose to stick around and aren't the sort of speaker that jumps on the plane right after they're done with their gig.
Yeah.
And I do that. And so I listen to a lot of amazingly smart people. I get to interview them. I get to talk to them about what they're most passionate about and gain ideas from that. So that's one input. I read a lot of books. I get sent a lot of books. Anytime you're in the media, as you know, you could pretty much request any book you want and people will, be happy to send you a copy to look at because everybody wants to get their ideas out there.
Sure.
So I get to see a lot of books. I buy a lot of books as well. I read a lot of magazines. And one of my tips actually in workshops when I teach people how to think more creatively is buy a magazine that's not targeted towards you and buy one outside of your industry. Because when you do that, you give yourself a mental chance to step outside of yourself. And if you just think about our algorithm-driven world where it's super easy to just read news that you agree with and just read stories that are in your one specific area and not really venture any further than that, you have to be intentional about challenging your point of view and about breaking off those tunnel vision blinders and really getting out to a world that you're not familiar with.
No, I definitely agree with that. I think it's very important, question your own beliefs and see what evidence would exist to change your mind about something. And you always need a devil's advocate argument or a red team to keep you on your toes and keep you defending your position. You mentioned you read a lot of books. Is there anything in particular, a title or an author that you would recommend to people that you really found helpful or influential in your life?
My reading tastes evolve quite dramatically. And so just to give you a sense, the two books that came to mind when you asked that, one was a book called Small Data by a guy named Martin Lindstrom, who's a consumer, he's sort of like a psychologist, a consumer psychologist. He studies consumer behavior by physically going and living in people's homes around the world.
Oh, wow.
And then he writes about his experience of what he's learned about consumers based on being on the road and living in these people's houses. And so, not that many people take their dedication to that extent in order to write about why consumers do what they do. And so his book that came out probably almost a year ago now was a really interesting one. And there was another one that I just read by a guy named James Gleick called Time Travel. And that was not a business book at all. And it was just about the nature of time travel and what we understand about how time works and why it works the way that it works. And it was just a fascinating read that had nothing to do with any marketing or business at all.
Great, thanks for that. And I'll definitely put those titles in the show notes as well so that everyone can check those out. Walk me through your normal day. How do you spend your time? Do you have a dedicated set number of hours that you focus on spotting trends or consuming media?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, like many entrepreneurs probably tell you, I'm not exactly sure I have a single routine that I go through every day. It's probably easier for me to separate days into travel days and home days. Mm-hmm. And the travel days, I'll be keynoting an event somewhere, or I'll be running a workshop for a company. And so I'll be out there kind of doing that. If I'm at home and I'm working, or if I'm producing content, then my process is very much about kind of reading different materials. I have a whole RSS feed thing set up where I have like 400 different sources of input from many different places. And I kind of go through the stories there. And part of the reason why I do this in such a disciplined way is every Thursday morning I send out an email that I call Non-Obvious Insights. And the whole idea of that email is that I'm basically sending it out with 5 or 6 underappreciated stories that most people haven't seen that week. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm digging through stories in media every week to find 5 non-obvious things, which is actually not that easy if you think about it, because everybody tends to talk about the same stories that are out there. Mm-hmm. And so finding things that most people haven't seen and trying to do that on a weekly basis really keeps my instinct strong for making connections in ways that help me when it comes time to write the trend report.
Is that weekly email one that people can sign up for on your website? Is it a newsletter that goes out?
It is, yeah.
Great. So I'll definitely send people there, and the link will also be in the show notes if you want to sign up for that. Sounds like a great resource there. So getting into this particular book, the 2017 edition of Non-Obvious, how much do you think preconceived knowledge or bias plays into spotting the trends? Is there anything that you spotted that really surprised you, that you didn't think we were moving that direction, and then through the evidence in the articles, you saw that we were?
The first part of your question, I mean, there is definitely preconceived bias when it comes to almost anything we do. And I'm no different. I have those when it comes to doing the trend predictions, to doing some of the reflection around them. But I try really hard to combat that with an intent of reading things that are outside of my world, in order to get stories and examples that are outside of my world. And so that's how I try and balance it out. In terms of something that surprised me this year, I mean, I think there was a trend I wrote about that I called the outrageous outsider. And when I started writing about it back in June or probably July of 2016, the idea was kind of about how you need someone from outside of an industry to kind of shake things up. And how it was sort of the Richard Branson model, that when Richard Branson got into airlines, you had Virgin Atlantic and Virgin America. Mm-hmm. And they started doing things in a very different way on multiple levels. And he's kind of recreated that when it came to kind of, probably his funniest venture, which was Virgin Brides, which was selling wedding dresses, which is just a great name.
Yeah, it is, yes.
But, he's consistently done that, and he's an outsider, and he benefits from being an outsider. What surprised me was after I'd written about it and we were going to final press with the book, that was right around the time when Trump won the election. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden this trend, and I had a component of it that I'd written about with politics, and I'd even mentioned Trump as being an outsider. But we just saw the power of that, the fact that people were voting predominantly based on the fact that he wasn't a politician in a traditional sense. And, a lot of people didn't like that about him, but the people who voted for him did like that about him, and that became the kind of single rallying cry. And so that surprised me just how powerful that was.
Yeah, great job spotting that. I think 2016 could really be called the year of the outsider. And 2017 is when we're going to begin to see the effects of this trend. And there are a few other trends that you spotted as well that really stood out to me. In your new book, you mentioned things like invisible technology, the robot renaissance, and self-aware data. Whenever I give media interviews and during my keynote lectures, I often mention that the human body is quickly becoming a part of the Internet of Things. You know, people often think of the Internet of Things as this external occurrence. Their devices will be speaking with one another. But that's not the entire story. Our bodies will also be communicating with these devices, and these devices will be passing information back to our bodies. And all of this might even be happening subconsciously, without us even realizing it. So I have to say, it is reassuring and a bit of a validation to see an outsider such as yourself noticing and corroborating this vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's well, first of all, it's great validation for me that people in the industry are seeing the connections as well. So, you mentioned invisible technology, and if you think about it, I mean, one of the stories I talk about in the book is MIT's innovation around a functional skin tattoo called DuoSkin, and the idea of being able to slide your finger on this tattoo and control your device solely through that, or this emerging field of kind of ultra haptics, or like haptic responses, and being able to read people's movement and actually have devices interact with humans based on just moving the way we move through the air, or the way our hands move through the air. And the fascinating possibilities of that in an environment like an automobile, for example, where you have all of this autonomy coming in, and then the role of the human, like what is that, right? And how we interact with our cars, and do we even need to touch these devices anymore? I mean, why do these things need to be touched when you have things like Alexa and Google Home and Cortana and all of this stuff, and Siri that we just talk to?
Yeah, those are great points. We're still determining how we'll end up interacting with this technology, especially when the traditional means are no longer necessary, or in some cases even possible. I recently had the opportunity to drive. Well, see, I use the word drive there because I don't even have the vocabulary to talk about this yet. But I recently had the opportunity to get behind the wheel of one of the self-driving Ubers we are piloting here in Pittsburgh. And just out of habit, I had my hands resting on the steering wheel the entire time. I wasn't driving, but I just didn't know what else to do. And I didn't even know how to describe what it was that I was doing.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing also about the autonomous cars is, this is something that I was just speaking about at an event targeted at people who were looking at services for the senior care market. Was that the innovators, if you think about it, if you think about the definition of someone who's an early adopter, it's someone who takes early technology that maybe isn't quite proven yet and tries it because they're just an early adopter. And the behaviors that we typically associate with early adopters are also associated with people who tend to be younger. We don't tend to say early adopters are old people. And yet, if you think about autonomous cars and what they offer to the elderly population, you may have a situation where this is one of those technologies where the earliest adopters will be the oldest among us. And that is fascinating if you think about the adoption of technology curve and how it usually happens versus how it might happen for something like this, where the older person who's kind of 85 years old and unable to drive themselves anywhere is much more likely to say an autonomous vehicle is a perfect option for them to get around.
Absolutely. Autonomous transportation has the ability to offer new possibilities and independence for people unable to use a car due to age or ability. And like you mentioned, some of the people who can benefit most from this are in the demographic that is typically skeptical of new technology. I hear from people all the time who are shocked that I trusted the technology enough to ride in an autonomous car, and they say they would never get in one. I look forward to the day that this changes, and we can really see this technology fulfill its potential of offering both freedom and increased safety. I recently saw an interesting article from Slate which argued that the proliferation of autonomous vehicles could have an unintended side effect, a shortage of organ donations. These safer vehicles will make healthy organs harder to come by, meaning that those in need of a transplant could die. This technology is certainly going to impact healthcare, and healthcare is another thing you've written and spoken about quite often. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the most drastic and important changes occur in this field. In what other ways do you see healthcare changing?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I co-authored a book specifically about changes in healthcare back in 2015. Actually, it came out in 2014, but it was called ePatient 2015, and it was just focused on healthcare because it's such a huge area. But I think one of the ways that it relates to this year's trend report is the other technology trend you mentioned, which is self-aware data. And if you think about the idea of self-aware data, essentially what it's saying is that all this data that we're collecting, and typically what we do with it is analyze it. But what if the data was smart enough to realize what it should do based on analyzing itself? And it sounds a little scary in some cases. Anytime you put self-aware next to anything technology related,
Yes.
there's a fear factor there.
Yeah.
But if you think about the way that we can set up things for example, robo-advisors and financial transactions, and having algorithms set up to say, okay, if a price hits this point, then you sell, and if a price hits that point, then you buy. I mean, this is data that's kind of making decisions based on its own rules that we've created. And in some cases, we're allowing that technology to learn. So if you think about the farming industry and how technology is baked into some of these new devices in the farming industry, where based on weather data and soil data and all of these measurements, it knows when certain crops need to get watered, and it can take care of it on its own.
So healthcare is certainly changing, but so many other things are as well. Are there any actionable items or advice that you like to give people to help them better prepare themselves, their families, and even their businesses for the changing world?
I think there's a couple things I would say. The first is learn to think outside of your industry. It's very, very hard to innovate if you are just focused on what others in your space or your industry or other people like you are doing. You have to look at something else in order to see that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is train yourself, and if you're running a team or a company, train your people to be more observant. A big part of why I can see these trends is not because I have some magical education or some amazing skill that no one else has. It's because I've trained myself to notice the things that other people don't notice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And one of the trends that you've noticed is what you refer to in the book as Moonshot Entrepreneurship. There are now a lot of entrepreneurs focused on more than just making a profit, and I think I would count myself among them. They want to, at a minimum, have a positive social impact, or even try to solve one of humanity's grand challenges. You bring up Elon Musk as an example of this, and I agree with you here. Moonshot entrepreneurship is really on the rise.
It really is. I mean, the only half joke that I kind of wrote about in the book was that it's no longer enough to have a lemonade stand and make some money if you're a kid, if your lemonade stand isn't going to save the world.
Yes.
And, you know, it's only partially a joke, because if you think about the new generation of entrepreneurs coming up, this idea of social good, of a company giving back something to the world, of having a positive impact in the world in some way, is totally baked in. It's not even a question about whether they should do it. And so this old model of let's eventually create a CSR campaign when we do something that gets us in trouble so that the CSR can help us win some PR points back, that's an old way of thinking about business.
Yeah, and just to translate for anyone who might be listening and may not know, CSR is an acronym standing for Corporate Social Responsibility. Are there any of these trends that you've outlined in the book that you see as being perhaps more disruptive than the others, or something we'll notice more in our day-to-day lives?
I think that there's a couple. Let me see if I can pick one that is most applicable. I think the trend of fierce femininity is a really interesting one, because it is two words that you don't typically see together, fierce and femininity. And yet, if you look at more and more examples in media, coming from Hollywood, or examples in business of female business leaders, you see this kind of mentality coming through more and more, of women not kind of staying back, waiting to be rescued in the tower. I mean, this is not a modern story. The modern story is the woman kind of, kicking butt, saving everybody and saving the world in the process. I mean, that's what we see in Hunger Games. That's what we see in Star Wars. That's all over the place. And so the way that changes our culture in terms of what we think about the gender imbalance, or whether there even is a gender imbalance, or what should be. There's this whole movement about whether that has said for several years now that toys shouldn't be labeled as toys for boys or toys for girls. They should just be toys. Like, why do we even need sections, right? So I don't believe in some of that. I mean, I think that whoever ascribes to that doesn't appreciate that there actually are gender differences between boys and girls, and we shouldn't kind of say that they don't exist. That's not a wise thing to do either, because it's not accurate. But I think that trend in particular is going to have a big impact in business.
Yeah, that's a big one, and you're touching on two distinct topics there, sex and gender. Many people lack an understanding of what that difference is, and that might be why this has been such a heated subject and has been in the news recently. So great job identifying that trend. On the other end of the spectrum, do you notice any predictions about the future that are being made that you think are overblown, that we shouldn't spend so much time focusing on?
I think that the most kind of overblown predictions that I tend to see are less focused on a specific type of technology and more focused on a specific platform. So people tend to put all their eggs into Snapchat, the Snapchat basket, for example. And they think Snapchat's going to change the world. And then something new comes along and everybody goes for that. And so I think that a lot of the hype tends to focus, both financially and media related, tends to focus on individual platforms or things that eventually turn out to be kind of blips and then go away, or at least become less popular. And so I see a lot of the sort of random hype around those and less focus on where it should be, which is the underlying human behavior that describes why that thing was popular in the first place.
I know you're very entrepreneurial yourself. Is it kind of difficult for you to see all of these trends that are happening in kind of unfulfilled places and not try to start? Like, how do you not own 8 million businesses right now? Is it hard for you to focus on one thing and not try to take advantage of all these coming trends?
That is probably my number one challenge, which is not so much trying to take advantage of all the trends, but focus, right? I mean, anytime you're an entrepreneur and you have all these ideas and you want to do all these things, your time only scales to a certain point. And so for me, one of my ongoing challenges is figuring out where do I want to spend that time. I mean, I own 3 companies now. I advise multiple startups myself. So, I'm doing quite a bit, but I actually enjoy my family too. Like, I would like to have some time for them as well. So finding that balance is a consistent thing that I really try and focus on now, because, I mean, any entrepreneur probably will tell you that one of the major reasons they became an entrepreneur was to have control of their own schedule and their own destiny. And if becoming an entrepreneur just means that I have less time to do what I really love, then that doesn't really make sense.
You're right, you do a lot, but there seems to be a common thread in all that you do, whether it's advising startups, writing books, delivering talks, or teaching your classes, and that's storytelling. Everything you do seems to be focused on spreading information in an interesting and memorable way that really gets through.
Yeah, it's interesting that you spotted that, because storytelling is a big motivator for me. I mean, I believe that stories are the way that we internalize ideas. I tell my trends to people through stories, either through a keynote presentation or even through the book. I mean, it's very story oriented in terms of how I write it. So it's not, here's the data point number 1, here's the data point number 2. It's, here are some stories of people who are doing this, and here's what connects them together. And I think that's what people want to see. That's what they want to read. That just makes for a more interesting lesson or insight.
Speaking of some of your stories, we've talked about Non-Obvious, but would you like to highlight any of your other works or anything you have coming in the pipeline that we should be aware of?
I do, yeah, both. So one of my other books was called Personality Not Included, and that was my first book, actually, and it was all about why companies need to be more human and have a personality. And at the time, it was sort of ahead of this idea of using social media and being more human. But now more and more companies are embracing that idea and the need for authenticity as part of that. So that was one of my earlier books. And then I do have a quite different book coming out in April of this year, right around the time of graduation for many students in high school or college. And it's a book about the advice that you wish you knew earlier in your career. and it's called Always Eat Left-Handed. And it's a book filled with a bunch of different tips and advice about how to be successful in your career. And it's really targeted at sort of the 18 to 25-year-old.
Well, that sounds great and very useful. Always Eat Left-Handed. That's an intriguing name, so I might have to go pick up a copy of that when it's available just to get the story behind that. For anyone who wants to find out when your book becomes available or to follow you online, where would you recommend they go?
So my personal website's probably the easiest place. It's just my first name and last name.com, so rohitbhargava.com. And from there, you can get links to all the books. You can get links to videos. I have an entire speaking section of my website where I've got videos like links to my TEDx talk and a bunch of other videos there, and information for anyone who's kind of looking for a speaker for an event. And then I've got a bunch of sort of other downloads and things like that people can get. And my weekly newsletter comes from there as well.
And one last thing that I have to ask you about before you go. I know the 2017 book just came out, but is there anything that's already on your radar or a short list as a coming trend for 2018?
You have hit me at exactly the moment when I am in between even thinking about the new book. So January is my month off where I barely do anything because I've just launched the new book, and I start collecting ideas. I always say I start collecting ideas in sort of mid-January because that's when my birthday is. But really, I start collecting them in February. So I'm in my this is my mental holiday month where I just focus on the book that just came out. What are the trends there? And so I don't really know anything about 2018 except for what color the cover is going to be.
Oh, well, that's something. What color is the cover?
Yeah, the next cover will be purple. So the 2018 book, every year has a colored theme. So 2015 was the first time it was out in print, and that was yellow because of the balloon on the cover. 2016 was blue, 2017 was red, and 2018 will be purple.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. 2018 is the year of purple. But I totally understand your need for a mental break. That's very important for everyone to get. Relaxation is so crucial not only for your health, but also to keep your productivity high when you are working. So before we end the conversation, do you have any parting messages for my audience or something you'd like them to keep in mind?
I'd say the biggest thing is the same thing that I tell anybody who kind of reads this book or reads about trends, and something that I actually spend a decent part of the first part of the book talking about, which is you don't have to be some sort of a professionally MIT-trained futurist in order to think in this way and in order to start to predict trends. What you do have to use is the right kind of methodology to learn to think in this way. But I believe, and I've seen this over and over with people that I've coached and trained, that anyone can learn how to do this. So if I could leave your audience with one message, it would be one of empowerment, that you don't just have to listen to so-called experts talking about trends. You can learn how to do this and see the patterns for yourself.
That's a great message and absolutely true. The ability to learn and make connections has really been democratized with the proliferation and ubiquity of technology. There used to be geographic, temporal, or financial barriers that many faced and made this information inaccessible. But now we can get news and information from all around the world and throughout history, so the possibilities are endless. That's a great parting message. Rohit, thank you again for speaking with me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Rohit Bhargava. Make sure to check out the show notes on the recently redesigned futuregrind.org, and you can find us on iTunes, YouTube, and the brand new Future Grind Facebook page. Feel free to subscribe, like, and share to spread the word, and we hope to see you next time on Future Grind.